The chandeliers glimmered like frozen stars above the ballroom, their light spilling across polished marble floors and gilded columns. Waiters moved in careful choreography, weaving between tuxedos and gowns, carrying trays stacked with glasses of champagne that sparkled with effervescent bubbles. Laughter swirled in the air, the laughter of people who had never worried about bills, who thought struggle was something that happened to others in a different world. The music, smooth and expensive, seemed to melt into the background, an unending hum designed to keep the wealthy entertained. The gala was more than a party. It was a parade of power. In the middle of this grand theater, Maya balanced a tray on her shoulder with quiet precision. She had learned the rhythm of these events, the subtle timing of stepping forward when a hand extended, the silence required to blend into the background, the resilience needed to swallow comments that weren't always kind. She wore the simple uniform of the staff, crisp black and white that contrasted with the sparkling silks and tailored suits surrounding her. At 22, she was younger than most of the servers, but her back was straight and her steps unshaken, even though her heart raced every time someone looked at her too long. She needed the money. That thought grounded her through every shift. Tuition bills, rent, groceries, all stacked against her like invisible weights. She had promised herself she wouldn't falter. Tonight wasn't just about carrying drinks, it was about carrying her future. At the far end of the room, towering over conversations like an emperor in exile, stood Richard Caldwell. His suit was custom-tailored, the kind that whispered its price before he even moved. His smile was sharp, his eyes predatory, scanning the room not for companionship but for leverage. Richard had built his empire on deals struck over tables just like these, where flattery flowed thicker than the wine. Whispers said he was here to finalize a deal worth $200 million, an international merger that would make him even richer, if that were possible. Everyone wanted to be near him, to brush against his aura of success, to claim they knew him. Maya noticed him long before he noticed her. It was hard not to. Guests orbited him like satellites, laughing too loudly at his jokes, nodding too eagerly at his stories. He carried himself like a man certain the world would bow to him, and perhaps it often did. She kept her eyes down, focusing instead on her tray, on not stumbling, on breathing through the ache in her arms. Then, his voice cut through the crowd, directed at her. "You! Over here!" Maya blinked, startled, before adjusting course and gliding toward him. She offered the tray, holding it steady though her palms grew slick with nerves. He plucked a glass from it, then squinted at her like she was an equation that didn't add up. "Finally," he said loud enough that half the table heard. "Took you long enough. Can you even read the labels, or are you just too stupid?" The word cracked like a whip in the air. Stupid. For a moment, everything froze. A violinist faltered, then recovered. The guests seated closest shifted uncomfortably, their laughter cut short, replaced by whispers. Maya stood there, rooted, her spine rigid though a hot flush of humiliation crawled up her neck. Her fingers dug into the edge of the tray, knuckles whitening, but she didn't let it tremble. Richard took a sip of champagne as if nothing unusual had happened, as though insulting her was no different than breathing. His lips curved into a smirk, self-satisfied. A few at his table gave nervous chuckles, not out of amusement but out of fear of not joining in, of not aligning themselves with the powerful man at the head of the table. Maya's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to remind him she had been nothing but efficient, that she had crossed the room as quickly as humanly possible, that she had been working tirelessly all evening without a single mistake. But the words lodged in her throat. She was a server here, nothing more in their eyes. To answer back could mean losing her job, and with it, the fragile stability she was clinging to. So she swallowed her pride, lifted her chin ever so slightly, and said nothing. Silence became her armor, though inside, a storm raged. The people around the table avoided her eyes. Not one voice rose in her defense. It was easier, safer, to let it pass. In this room, power protected cruelty, and everyone knew it. But across the room, an older man observed quietly. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, but his gaze never wavered. He had seen the moment, the sharp insult, the quiet dignity with which Maya endured it. His fingers tapped once against the table before he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing with thought. Unlike the others, he was not afraid of Richard Caldwell. Maya turned to leave, her tray lighter, her pride heavier. She focused on the rhythm of her steps, on the way the heels clicked against the marble, each one reminding her that she still stood, still moved, still endured. But her chest burned, and the word echoed in her skull like a cruel mantra, stupid. Richard returned to his conversation, boasting about market shares and acquisitions, laughing loudly at his own jokes. His entourage leaned in, desperate to stay in orbit, while the air around him thickened with arrogance. The insult faded from his mind as quickly as it had left his lips. To him, it was a passing remark, not worth remembering. To Maya, it was carved into the moment, unforgettable, a scar etched into the glittering night. Yet the night was long, and the story was not finished. The insult was only the beginning. As the orchestra swelled again and the hum of conversation resumed, Maya caught her reflection in a gilded mirror. She saw the uniform, the tray, the stooped weight of invisibility, and then she saw her eyes, steady, unwilling to break. She whispered to herself beneath her breath, a promise no one else could hear, not forever. This is not forever, What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man who had witnessed everything was about to change the course of the evening. The humiliation she had endured would not vanish into the night, because the wrong person had chosen to watch quietly, storing the moment like a blade being sharpened in the dark. The gala shimmered on, the chandeliers blazing, the laughter returning. But beneath it all, a crack had formed, a quiet fracture in the illusion of untouchable wealth and power. Richard Caldwell didn't see it. Maya didn't know it. But the crack would widen before the night was through, and when it did, the whole room would watch everything Richard thought unshakable crumble at his feet. And as Maya moved forward balancing her tray, she carried more than glasses, she carried the weight of a storm waiting to break. The music swelled again as if a hand had turned the volume up on the whole evening, and conversation poured back over the insult like lacquer, glossy and hard. Maya set the empty flute on a back station, rolled her shoulders once to release the burn, and stepped back into the orbit of tables. She found the rhythm, breathe, smile, offer, pivot, though the words still hissed in the back of her skull. She made herself smaller, not from shame but to survive the next hour, glide around trouble, avoid the splash radius of the powerful. A guest in emerald silk touched her sleeve. "Sparkling water, please." The woman's eyes were soft, apologetic in a way her voice wasn't allowed to be in this room. Maya nodded and returned with a bottle and a twist of lime. The woman whispered, "Some people mistake volume for significance," and then looked away before Maya could answer. The kindness stung almost as much as the insult, too small to change anything, too honest to ignore. At the captain's station, the hotel manager waited with folded arms, jaws set. "You okay?" he muttered without looking directly at her. "I'm working," she said. "Good. Keep it that way. Don't engage. That table is sensitive." His eyes flicked toward the gold centerpieces at the far end, where laughter had grown louder and more brittle. "Copy," she said, and lifted another heavy tray. By then, the older gentleman had risen from his seat and moved toward a shadowed alcove where a discreet security console and 2 staff members stood. He exchanged a few quiet words. One staffer slipped out a side door. The other nodded, eyes widening a fraction at whatever name had been spoken. He returned to his table with the unhurried grace of a man who understood the power of timing. Maya made a sweep through the center tables, replenishing wines, offering petite desserts that looked like jewels. Near the band, a cluster of junior financiers craned their necks toward the head table and lowered their voices. "Did you hear him? Loud enough to register on seismographs. He's closing tonight. He can say whatever he wants. Not to everyone. Not like that." They fell suddenly silent when she drew near, forcing smiles wide and empty. She felt like a mirror. People only liked what she reflected when it flattered them. A maitre d' tapped her shoulder. Head table asked for a Burlo, the Montfort. You know the one. I do. She kept her voice steady, though the name hooked into her nerves. The good stuff. The showpiece bottle. The excuse? In the service hallway, the hum dropped to fluorescent buzz. She retrieved the Burlo from the locked cabinet, verified the vintage, checked the label against the list, and carried it back with care. As she approached, laughter bubbled up from Richard's table, high-pitched, not entirely natural. He was midway through a story, hands painting the air as if he were molding the memory as he spoke. And so I told the minister, if you want efficiency, you hire excellence. If you want excuses, you hire sentiment. More laughter, the kind that claimed complicity. Maya set the bottle on the side cart, presented the label, and reached for the waiter's key. Richard turned to her as though noticing she existed for the first time since the insult. That one, he said, tapping the glass with a finger. But careful. Don't massacre it. I won't, she said, and began the ritual, foil cut cleanly, cork eased slow and true, the soft sigh of seal breaking. She poured a small taste into his glass and stepped back a half pace. He swirled, sniffed, sipped, and made a show of thinking. Acceptable, he pronounced. Then his eyes sharpened, hunting for sport. Tell me, what makes a Montfort Burlo distinct from Serralunga? His voice carried, intentionally. A couple of nearby tables turned their faces like flowers to sun. Maya knew the trap. The test wasn't information. It was humiliation disguised as curiosity. She could have given him the answer, she did know it, but her job was to serve, not to be interrogated into entertainment. She answered anyway, evenly. Montfort tends to have firmer tannins and more structure than some neighbors, often demanding more aging to soften. Serralunga can be similar in power, but the expressions differ by producer and site. This bottle should open beautifully with a few minutes of air. A hitch in the sound around them, like a needle catching on vinyl. The gentleman in the shadows tilted his head, interested. Richard's eyebrows lifted just a fraction before his smile thinned. He didn't like losing control of a narrative. Rehearse, he said, dismissive. A script. Do your supervisors make you memorize a wine Wikipedia entry to impress people you'll never be? Some guests looked down, a few drank faster. One of Richard's lieutenants leaned back to watch, amusement flickering like a lighter's flame. Maya kept her eyes on the bottle, not his face. She poured for the others, filling each glass to the same level, steady and precise. The smell of the wine rose warm and herbal, red fruit and tar and violets. She imagined the hillside it had come from, vines in rows, soil dark and patient, and let that thought hold her spine straight. When she finished, she stepped away. The manager hovered at the perimeter, ready to intercede if anything spilled into conflict, but unwilling to jeopardize a high roller's favor. It was always the same calculus: who can cause the most trouble later? Richard raised his glass and stood. A toast, he announced, and the band quieted. A hush rippled to the back drapes. To merit. To winning. To refusing the lie that everyone deserves the same outcome no matter there. He paused, letting the words dangle. Talent. It wasn't a slur. It didn't need to be. The angle of it was clear enough. He clinked with the nearest guest. Glasses lifted. The toast spread, dutiful and thin. The older gentleman did not raise his glass. Maya's cheeks heated again, but the feeling was different now, edged with a strange clarity. She had been invisible, then she'd been a target. Now she was a measuring stick for who in this room still remembered how to be human. The thought steadied her. She pivoted away, but a woman at the far side reached up and touched her wrist. You spoke well, the woman said softly, then released her like a secret. The next hour stretched tight. The room reached its late evening confidence, deals progressing from small talk to signatures, numbers whispered behind floral arrangements, certain guests growing sloppier with power and drink. At a gallery of desserts, two men in their 30s made a bet about whether the pastry chef's meringue would hold its shape and laughed so hard at themselves they nearly toppled the tower. Maya stepped in, saved it with a quick hand, and took the hit for their carelessness with a smile that never touched her eyes. Near the coat check doors, a young busser murmured, "You want me to take that section?" She shook her head. "I've got it. You shouldn't have to. It'll be over soon." He glanced toward the head table. "Hope so." Back on the floor, Richard's voice rose again, cutting through the refined noise. He was telling another story, this one about out-negotiating a union. "I brought them a spreadsheet and a reality check," he said, basking in the chuckles. "If feelings were currency, you'd all be billionaires." He reached for his glass and found it empty. He didn't wait. He snapped his fingers. The sound, small and sharp, crackled through Maya's nerves as she approached. "Another," he said, not looking at her. She refilled to the line. As she turned to go, he added, "You could at least smile properly. Is it that hard?" His voice was lighter now, the cruelty almost playful, the kind that expected complicity. She met his eyes. Not long. Just enough to register that there was a person on the other side of the tray. "I'm working," she said, and moved on. A slight stir behind her. Someone had seen it. The older gentleman, whose name she still didn't know, had angled his chair toward the aisle and watched her pass with a focus that felt like a promise. His aide returned and leaned down to whisper. He listened, nodded once, and patted the man's shoulder as if to say, "Good work." The hotel manager intercepted Maya near the service door, nervous smile fixed. "Everything fine?" "Yes." "The gentleman at the head table, if he asks for anything unusual, loop me in first. We just want to keep the train on the tracks." "What if he asks to push someone in front of it?" The words almost slipped out, but she swallowed them back into the professionalism that paid her rent. She said only, "I'll let you know." On her next pass, she found the older gentleman at the edge of the dance floor, speaking with the event host. The host's expression registered surprise, then dawning approval. A microphone changed hands, not overtly, but not hidden either. It was the kind of transition only people who notice everything would see. A slow song started. Couples drifted onto the floor. Richard did not dance. He stood, phone in hand, murmuring into his earpiece while his lieutenant checked a message and grinned like a man who had just seen his bonus. They were certain of the night's trajectory. Why wouldn't they be? Power had taught them that the future always arrived on schedule. Near the bar, Maya saw her mother's name light up on her phone screen, just for a second, in the reflection on polished glass, memory rather than call. She pictured the hands that had braided her hair before school, the quiet endurance in those fingers, the lesson embedded deep: don't let someone else's smallness make you smaller. She put down the memory like a touchstone, and kept moving. A guest with a camera recorded a sweep of the room, the chandeliers, the band, the crowd, and in the edge of the frame, the head table lay like a stage set waiting for its star's next line. The camera paused a heartbeat on Maya, then drifted away. She didn't see it. She was already turning toward the older gentleman, who lifted a single finger, not to summon, but to ask a favor. "Would you bring me the same Barolo?" he asked when she approached. His voice was quiet, rich with ease. "2 fresh glasses, please." "Of course." She felt, for the first time that night, the simple relief of being treated as if her work mattered. When she returned, he looked her in the eye and said, "Thank you." Then, after a beat, "Would you stay nearby for a moment?" It wasn't a command. It landed like consideration. She hovered at a respectful distance as he poured himself a splash, and the same for the empty seat beside him. He swirled the glass, letting the light catch the wine's rim, and then placed it carefully on the linen. The second glass remained untouched, a placeholder for someone not yet seated. Across the room, the event host stepped to the small dais and lifted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and the band softened. "Before we move into the closing portion of our evening, we have a brief acknowledgement." Heads turned. The swarm of cameras reoriented like a school of fish sensing a current. Richard glanced up, annoyed at being interrupted by anything that didn't feature him. The older gentleman rose, buttoned his jacket with an unhurried gesture, and started toward the head table. As he passed Maya, he offered the faintest of nods, as if they shared a secret. His aide ghosted along the perimeter, speaking to 2 staffers and the house sound engineer. The rooms hummed thin to a hush threaded with curiosity. The hotel manager shifted, unsure whether to intervene or stand out of history's way. The financier clustered by the band leaned forward, scenting blood without knowing whose. At Richard's table, the lieutenant straightened, trying to calculate whether this attention belonged to an opportunity or a trap. Maya's pulse climbed, but it wasn't panic, it was recognition. The crack beneath the evening had widened enough to swallow a misstep whole. She set her tray down on the side station, palms suddenly free. The older gentleman reached the dais. The host handed him the microphone. "Thank you," he said, voice calm, carrying. He looked not at the room first, but at the head table. Richard's face arranged itself into a smile so fast it looked painful. The older gentleman let the quiet breathe a moment longer, the way you let a wine open before the first sip. Then he turned his hand slightly, inviting attention toward the aisle where Maya stood, unarmored but unbroken, and said, "I'd like to address something I witnessed tonight." The band's last notes dissolved into stillness. Glasses hung halfway to lips. 100 eyes found her without her moving an inch. The older gentleman glanced once more at Richard, something like disappointment flickering and hardening into resolve. "And before I do," he added, "I need a certain person to hear me clearly." He stepped closer to the head table, microphone steady, the room braced for impact, and in that suspended second, right before the first word of reckoning, every sound in the ballroom seemed to lean toward the same point, poised on the edge of whatever would happen next. The microphone hummed faintly as the older gentleman's voice threaded through the silence, calm yet resonant, carrying more weight than the chandeliers above or the marble beneath. Every head tilted toward him, every whisper drowned beneath the gravity in his tone. "I saw something tonight that cannot be ignored," he began. His gaze lingered not on the audience but on the head table, on Richard Caldwell, who straightened in his chair with the stiffness of a man who suddenly felt the floor shifting under him. "It was a moment that revealed more than wealth, more than power, more than deals scribbled on contracts," the gentleman continued. His words were deliberate, unhurried, like stones dropped into still water. "It revealed character." Richard laughed lightly, forced, as though brushing dust off his sleeve. "Daniel, come now," he said loudly, trying to reclaim the air. "We're at a party. Surely no one wants a sermon." But the gentleman, Daniel Whitmore, didn't falter. His voice grew sharper, though it never rose in volume. "Character is not a sermon, Richard. It's the currency that outlasts money, the legacy that outlasts signatures. And tonight you revealed yours." A ripple coursed through the crowd. Guests leaned closer, their champagne forgotten, sensing a current far stronger than gossip. Maya stood frozen by the service station, her pulse thrumming, unsure whether to flee or witness what was unfolding. Daniel turned, his eyes sweeping across the room before landing on her. He gestured slightly. "That young woman," he said, pointing to Maya. The spotlight of silence followed. "She is not invisible, though you treated her as if she were." Maya's chest tightened, her throat suddenly dry. 100 eyes bore into her, some sympathetic, some curious, some merely greedy for drama. She gripped the edge of the cart beside her to keep steady. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his smirk wavering. "Oh, for heaven's sake! It was a joke. A bit of banter. Staff know how to take it. Don't they?" He tossed the last words in Maya's direction, his tone sharp, demanding complicity. She didn't answer. Daniel stepped closer to the head table, his presence like a tide pushing back against Richard's bluster. "A joke?" His brow furrowed, his tone cutting like tempered steel. "Insulting someone's intelligence because they serve you is no joke. It is arrogance. It is cruelty. And it is unacceptable." Gasps fluttered across the hall. Several guests nodded discreetly, emboldened by the authority in Daniel's stance. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to choose sides but unable to look away. Richard's voice hardened, defensive now. "Daniel, you're overreacting. This is business. You and I both know this deal is too important for theatrics." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with deliberate calm, he asked, Do you know who she is? The question hung in the air. Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard. A waitress, he said dismissively, waving a hand. That's all. Maya felt the words pierce deeper than the earlier insult. Not for herself, she had heard worse, but for the way he spoke as though she were an object, a utility without history or meaning. Daniel's voice sharpened. That waitress is Maya Carter, daughter of Dr. Elaine Carter, whose medical breakthroughs in immunotherapy saved millions of lives. Perhaps even someone you know. Her mother is one of the most respected minds of our time. The ballroom buzzed. Whispers grew louder. Recognition sparked in some faces. Yes, Dr. Carter, the Nobel nominee, the woman who had stood on magazine covers for her contributions to medicine. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. For once, words didn't leap to his defense. Daniel pressed on. Maya is here tonight not because she needs validation, not because she seeks pity, but because she chooses to work for her education. She believes dignity is earned, not handed down. That is strength. That is intelligence. That is honor. All eyes flicked back to Maya, who stood stiff, her hands clasped before her, her heart a wild drum. She wanted to shrink into the walls, but at the same time something inside her flared, a spark she had buried under years of restraint. Richard forced a laugh again, brittle, hollow. Well, that's all very touching, but it changes nothing. We're here for business, Daniel. Sentiment doesn't sign contracts. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. On the contrary, Richard. Everything rests on sentiment, on trust, on respect, on the knowledge that those you partner with hold themselves to a standard worth standing beside. And tonight you've shown the opposite. Richard's face flushed red, his fists clenching on the tablecloth. You can't mean. I can't, Daniel interrupted, his tone final, reverberating through the hall. And I do. There will be no deal. Not tonight, not ever. $200 million may sound like fortune to some, but it is dust compared to integrity. And I will not invest 1 cent in a man who devalues people to inflate himself. A collective gasp swept the room, sharp and audible, like air sucked from a flame. Cameras lifted, phones discreetly angled. The whispers became a storm. Asterisk, did you hear that? He pulled the deal. 200 million, gone, on the spot. Asterisk. Richard lurched to his feet, his voice a snarl. You're making a mistake, Daniel. You'll regret this. But Daniel didn't flinch. The only regret is yours. You mistook fear for respect, silence for consent. But people remember how you treat those who can give you nothing. And they will remember tonight. Maya exhaled slowly, realization dawning that she had just witnessed the empire of a man begin to crumble with a single refusal. The orchestra's instruments lay silent, the band watching wide-eyed. Guests exchanged glances, some already calculating the fallout, others savoring the poetic justice. A few rose to clap politely, not for spectacle but for courage. The applause spread, tentative at first, then growing louder, echoing against the marble and gilded walls. Maya felt her eyes sting, not with weakness but with a sudden release of something long held tight. For the first time that evening, she wasn't invisible. Richard stood rigid, his smirk shattered, his posture exposed. The laughter that once orbited him had evaporated, replaced by the sound of a room siding against him. Daniel lowered the microphone and placed it gently on the table. He turned to Maya, and for the first time all evening, she saw warmth in his expression, not as a savior but as a man acknowledging her humanity. You carry yourself with grace, he said quietly enough for her to hear, though the nearest guests leaned in hungrily. More than many in this room. Maya nodded, words locked in her chest, her gratitude unspoken but radiating through her trembling hands. The storm of whispers grew, the tension coiled tight as the crowd awaited Richard's next move, desperate to see whether he would bow, rage, or crumble. And in that suspended breath, just before the final act of the night unfolded, everyone knew something irreversible had just been set in motion. The fall of Richard Caldwell had begun, and the weight of it would echo long after the chandeliers dimmed. Applause ebbed into a stunned hush that seemed to rinse the room clean of its earlier sheen. Conversations fractured into fragments, shocked exhalations, muffled phones buzzing on silent, the scrape of a single chair leg across marble. The band members exchanged glances and lowered their instruments like soldiers standing down. When silence settled fully, it felt earned, like the air itself had chosen a side. He remained standing, rigid, the smile long gone, hands flattened on the linen as if he could iron the moment back into shape. He looked first to his lieutenant for rescue, then to the investors at neighboring tables, then to the event host, as though any of them could rewind a public refusal delivered with that kind of calm finality. Eyes slid away. People who had orbited him all evening found new planets, coats to fetch, bathrooms to discover, suddenly vital calls to take. Power has a sound when it leaves a room. It's the soft scuff of expensive shoes backing away. He cleared his throat, his voice scraping against pride. "Let's be reasonable," he said to the older gentleman, forcing a laugh that landed like broken glass. "We can talk privately. No need to make a spectacle." The answer was gentle and immovable. "The spectacle was the insult," came the reply, even unembarrassed. "The correction merely restores balance." A murmur rippled outward. It wasn't triumphal. It felt more like relief, as if the room had been holding a breath for years it didn't know it was holding. She stood where she had been rooted the whole time, hands resting at her sides now instead of clenched against a tray. It was a small shift, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. But it changed her height, the line of her shoulders, the way the light found her face. She did not step forward to make herself a symbol. She did not retreat to become a shadow. She stayed, present, human, undeniable. The event host, steadying the evening with the instinct of a practiced ringmaster, leaned toward the microphone. "We'll take a brief interlude," he said, with a nod to the band. A soft piano line unfurled, cushioning the moment without burying it. A few claps started, respectful rather than raucous, and then faded. The music didn't try to erase what had happened, it made space for it. At the head of the deserted table, his phone buzzed twice, 3 times, relentless. His lieutenant checked his own screen and paled. "Press picked it up," the man whispered, then corrected himself, seeing cameras trained not by paparazzi but by attendees. "Everyone picked it up." He tried for control. "We'll get ahead of it. Draft a statement. Emphasize misunderstanding. Reframe it as stress. Emphasize nothing." He snapped back, lower now, the veneer thinning. "Do not confirm the number." The older gentleman turned from the dais and approached her. Conversation swelled again, a tide rising around an island. He stopped with the careful distance of someone who understood how proximity could be misread, and his voice, when he spoke, was for her alone even if the nearest tables were straining to overhear. "You stood your ground without striking back," he said. "That's a kind of strength people underestimate." She found her voice somewhere in the quiet place she had retreated to during countless long nights. "I stood because I needed the job," she said, no shame in the truth. "And because my mother taught me that not every blow has to be returned to be answered." He smiled, something warm flickering in the eyes that had moments earlier cut like flint. "Your mother is a wise woman." He reached into his jacket and offered a card. No flourish, no spectacle. "If you ever want a different room to stand in, call me. No pressure. No charity. Just an open door." She took the card without looking at it, because looking at it would be too much like admitting she wanted it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Near the bar, 2 event coordinators conferred in urgent whispers. The hotel manager approached the head table with a professional neutral face that couldn't hide relief. "Is there anything we can get you?" he asked the man whose name was starting to drift from conversations like an actor's credits after a bad premiere. "Coffee? Car called?" The offer was polite. The subtext was a velvet rope tugging toward the exit. He waved the manager away, then pointed across the room. "You!" he barked, not bothering with names now that names weren't coming to him when he reached for them. "You started this," he said to the older gentleman. "You just cost your investors a serious return. I protected them from a partner who would have been a liability." The reply came, soft enough to force the room to quiet to hear it. There are returns you can't model, and losses you can't hedge by hiding them. The lieutenant murmured again. Board members are texting. They want you to leave. We should control optics. A brittle word, optics, as though sight could be managed when eyes had already seen. A woman in emerald silk, the one who had asked for sparkling water and offered a whispered kindness earlier, found a path to the service station. She didn't speak at first. She just stood beside her, not interfering, not pitying. After a moment she said, My firm funds fellowships. If you're studying, I'd be honored to connect you. The words were simple. Their shape was generosity without spectacle. She nodded because this, too, was a door. I'm finishing my biochem prerequisites, she said, the sentence doing something to her posture she hadn't expected. I want the lab. The real work, not the glossy panels. The woman's smile reached the corners of her eyes. That's the only kind of work that lasts. Across the floor, a small knot of guests formed around the older gentleman. Some shook his hand with the gratitude of people who had needed permission to do what they already knew was right. Others passed cards, not to leverage the moment, but to align with the principle that had just redrawn the room. A few, quieter than the rest, simply said, Thank you, and disappeared into the crowd, changed and unwilling to make content out of it. His exit, when it finally came, was not dramatic. No slammed doors, no shouted final words. He gathered himself, his phone, his dignity in tatters, and walked toward the side corridor where a private elevator waited to ferry him away from the echo of murmurs fermenting into memory. As he passed the bar, a glass tipped, accident, gravity, a hand that couldn't quite hold steady, and shattered. He flinched. Several heads turned. The sound skittered across tile and disappeared into the music. She watched him go because to look away would be to pretend this had been a dream. It hadn't. It was a record written in the eyes of everyone present. She didn't gloat. Victory felt different than she'd imagined. It wasn't sweet. It was clean, like a wound irrigated until it could heal. The piano faded. The bandleader, sensing the room's heartbeat return to normal rhythm, eased the musicians into a standard that had enough lift to keep the evening from collapsing and enough restraint to honor what had occurred. People danced again, but the steps were gentler. Laughter returned, less performative, more human. Her shift didn't end because justice had been done. The glassware still needed polishing. The plates still had to be cleared. She moved back into the work with hands that were the same hands as an hour ago, and not the same at all. A busser tried to take her section again, and she shook her head. I've got it, she said, and this time the words carried a different weight. The older gentleman settled his tab at the edge of the floor like any other guest, tipped generous without being ostentatious. He passed the card to the hotel manager instead of to her again. One offer is enough, anything more can feel like pressure, and then he turned and caught her eye from across the room. He didn't nod this time. He just held her gaze long enough to confirm what both of them knew. This was her moment, not his. The event host returned to the microphone. We honor excellence tonight, he said, and the phrase, recycled from countless programs, landed newly sincere. Not just in achievement, but in how we treat one another when the world isn't looking. Sometimes, the world decides to look. And sometimes, that's a good thing. The room answered with warm applause, not for the host, not even for the man who had refused the deal, but for an ideal that felt within reach again. When the last guests drifted toward the coat check, the chandeliers dimmed 1 degree, the room exhaling. She stacked plates at a service station and blew a fallen eyelash from her wrist. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't open it yet. She didn't need to. The card in her apron pressed a small, reassuring rectangle against her hip. She would call when she was ready. Not because someone had offered, but because she had chosen. By the staff entrance, the young busser leaned against the wall, wide-eyed. I've never seen anything like that, he said. His voice trembled with the dawning understanding that rooms like this could bend. She handed him a stack of folded linens. You will, she said. Maybe you'll be the one who bends it next time. Outside, the night had cooled. A line of cars idled, exhaust blooming into the streetlights. She stepped through the service door into the small slip of alley where employees took breaks and drew breath. The city hummed as if unaffected, but the sound was different to her now. Not louder. Closer. She thought of her mother, of late nights at the research center, of coffee gone cold, of the hum of centrifuges, of the way complexity yields to patience. She imagined telling her about the evening, not to make it a headline but to share the precise calibration of humiliation and recovery, fear and steadiness, insult and reply. She pictured her mother's eyes crinkling with the particular pride reserved for quiet victories. The door opened a crack, and the hotel manager stepped out, uncertain. "You did well," he said, awkward with sincerity. "If you need time or a different station next week, I'll be here," she said. "Same station's fine." Then, because truth is a muscle and it grows with use, she added, "But I won't be here forever." He nodded, understanding more than he could articulate, and let the door ease shut. She looked down the alley at the slice of street where a black sedan paused under a lamppost. A silhouette in the back seat glanced toward the hotel, then away. The car slipped into traffic and was absorbed, just another vehicle carrying a man away from a room that no longer behaved for him. Back inside, she finished her closing tasks with the concentration of a surgeon removing the last suture. She clocked out, untied her apron, and folded it along seams that had been reinforced by nights like this one. On her way through the lobby, a few lingering guests stepped aside with small gestures that looked like respect. Not grand. Not performative. Enough. At the threshold, she paused before the gilt-framed mirror where, earlier, she had rehearsed endurance. The reflection that met her now wore the same uniform and a different expression. She didn't smile at herself. She didn't need to. She lifted her chin a fraction and walked into the corridor, then into the night. Her phone buzzed again. She let it. Doors don't vanish when you choose to take a breath before walking through them. She turned the card over in her hand and read the name she already knew, the number she could have recalled blind, and slid it back into her pocket. The city spread in front of her like a circuit closing. She felt tired, not the kind that collapses, but the kind earned by work done right. Behind her, the ballroom staff rolled carts along the marble, quiet wheels whispering. Ahead, a bus exhaled at the corner, and a woman in emerald silk stepped into a car with the relief of someone who had aligned her actions with her conscience. Somewhere in a different neighborhood, a board assembled on late-night video and learned that money could be lost faster than it could be laundered by language. She walked. The air smelled like rain that hadn't yet arrived. Her future felt like that too, charged, ready. There would be statements she knew. Explanations. Spin. There would be those who would insist on misunderstanding because it kept their balance sheets intact. None of that would change the geometry of what had happened. A line had been drawn, not on paper, but across a night that people would reference when they needed courage. She reached a bus stop and sat, the quiet a blanket. When the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard, dropped her fare, and took a seat by the window. The city slid by in reflections. She traced one fingertip along the condensation at the edge of the glass, idly drawing a circle, then a line through it. Not an O. A zero struck through, a reminder that numbers mean nothing if you can't see the people they measure. At the next stop, a man got on with a bouquet of slightly wilted flowers, and a child asked her if the driver always took this route. "Mostly," she said, and smiled small and real. A push alert lit half the bus screens for those who had them. Breaking news about a cancelled deal, a public rebuke, a statement issued too late. She turned her phone face down and watched the city instead. By the time she reached her stop, the night had settled into itself. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the card in her pocket warm from her palm. She pictured a lab bench, a pipette, a line of samples awaiting her patients. She pictured a door opening that she would walk through on her own 2 feet. And as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she let herself think, just for a heartbeat, of the cost that had been exacted without her raising her voice, without her stepping out of the frame of her own dignity. The number was precise, the invoice stamped by the room itself. $200 million, paid in full by a single word finally answered.